Hello everybody. In today's lecture, we will be learning what are the various attribution errors in social psychology. The main objectives in this lesson are to understand errors in attribution and what is the fundamental attribution error. We will also be learning what is actor observer bias and also self-serving bias. Attributional errors. The attribution process is clearly subject to bias. For example, it can be biased by personality, biased by interpersonal dynamics or biased to meet communication needs. We do not approach the task of attributing causes for behavior in an entirely dispassionate, objective and unbiased manner. The cognitive mechanisms that are responsible for attribution may themselves be subject to imperfections that make them suboptimal. As evidence of attributional biases and errors accumulated, there was a shift of perspective. Instead of viewing people as naive scientists or even statisticians, we now think of people as cognitive misers or motivated tacticians. People use cognitive shortcuts called heuristics to make attributions that, although not always accurate or correct, are quite satisfactory and adaptive. Sometimes the choice of shortcut and the choice of attribution can also be influenced by personal motives. Biases are entirely adaptive characteristics of ordinary everyday social perception. In psychology, an attribution bias is a cognitive bias that affects the way we determine who or what was responsible for an event or action. It is natural for us to interpret events and results as the consequences of the purposeful actions of some person or some agent. Attribution biases typically take the form of actor observer differences. People involved in an action, which are actors, view things differently from people not involved, who are the observers. These discrepancies are often caused by asymmetries in availability, the frequently called salience in this context. For example, the behavior of an actor is easier to remember and therefore more available for later consideration than the setting in which he found himself, and a person's own inner turmoil is more available to himself than it is to someone else. The major attribution errors are fundamental attribution error. One of the best known attribution biases is correspondence bias, a tendency for people to over attribute behavior to stable underlying personality dispositions. This bias was originally called as the fundamental attribution error. Although the correspondence bias and fundamental attribution errors are not identical, the terms are often used interchangeably. The fundamental attribution error originally was identified by Ross in 1977. It is a tendency for people to make dispositional attributions for others' behavior even when there are clear external or environmental causes. This tendency to overestimate the extent to which other people's behavior results from internal dispositional factors and to underestimate the role of situational factors is called as the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error has been called as the correspondence bias. There have been many empirical demonstrations of the tendency to see people's behavior as a reflection of their dispositions and beliefs rather than as influenced by situation. For example, in a classic study done by Edward Jones and Victor Harris in 1967, college students were asked to read an essay written by a fellow student on controversial political topic. Specifically, students were asked to read an essay about what was in that era a hot button issue, whether to support or oppose the regime of Fidel Castro of Cuba. After reading an essay that either supported or opposed Castro, the participants had to guess how the author of the essay really felt about Castro. In one condition, the researchers told the students that the author had chosen freely which position he had to take in the essay, thereby making it easy to guess how he really felt. If he chose to write in favor of Castro, clearly he must be sympathetic to Castro. Much like if a student today chose to write an essay on in favor of affirmative action, we would likely assume that student was indeed a supporter of that policy. In another condition, the participants learned that author had been assigned the position in essay as part of a debate. Yet the participants in this study assumed that students really believed what they wrote, even knowing that they had no choice as to which position to take. This would be like assuming that someone assigned to argue an anti-abortion position in a class debate truly was deep down against abortion. This is the fundamental attribution error in action, overlooking the role of situation. And jumping to conclusions about internal explanations. Why is the fundamental attribution error so fundamental? It is not always wrong to make an internal attribution. Clearly, people sometimes do what they do because of the kind of people they are. Some yelling bosses are really jerks. However, considerable evidence indicates that social situations can strongly affect behavior. Indeed, the major lesson of social psychology is that these influences can be extremely powerful. The point of fundamental attribution error is that people often tend to underestimate external influences when explaining other people's behavior. Even when the influence of situation on behavior is obvious, as in Jones and Harris experiment, people persist in making internal attributions. The role of perceptual salience in the fundamental attribution error. Why do people fall prey to fundamental attribution error? One reason is that when we try to explain someone's behavior, our focus of attention is usually on the person, not on the surrounding situation. In fact, the situational causes of another person's behavior are practically invisible to us. If we do not know what happened to someone earlier in the day, example, she received an F on her midterm, we can't use that situational information to help us understand her current behavior. And even when we know her situation, we still do not know how she interprets it. Example, the F may not upset her because she is planning to drop the course anyway. If we do not know the meaning of the situation for her, we can't accurately judge its effects on her behavior. If information about the situational causes of behavior is unavailable or difficult to interpret, what does that leave us with? Although the whole of any given situation may be largely unknown or even out of sight for us, the individual is perceptually prominent. Our eyes and ears notice people, and what we notice seems like the reasonable and logical cause of observed behavior. We can't see the situation, so we overlook its importance. People, not the situation, have perceptual salience for us. We pay attention to them, think about them, and tend to assume that they alone cause their behavior. Example, Alexis falls asleep in the class. Sean attributes her behavior to laziness. When he fell asleep in the class last week, however, he attributed his own behavior to an all-nighter he pulled off while finishing a term paper. There are two explanations for this bias. First, we tend to overlook the effect of social roles on behaviors. For example, we might see salespersons as extroverted and persistent people because we ignore the fact that their jobs require them to behave in this way to boost sales. Second, we tend to generalize the behaviors we observe when people are in constrained and constant situations to other different situations and conclude that it is due to dispositional cause rather than situational cause. It is most visible when people explain the behavior of others. It does not explain interpretations of one's behavior, where situational factors are often taken into consideration. This discrepancy is called the actor-observer bias. Fundamental attribution error refers to the tendency to make attributions to internal causes when focusing on someone else's behavior. When looking at the behavior of others, we tend to underestimate the impact of situational forces and overestimate the impact of dispositional forces. Most people ignore the impact of role pressures and other situational constraints on others and behavior as caused by people's intentions, motives, and attitudes. Actor-observer effect. The actor-observer effect really an extension of the correspondence bias. It refers to the tendency for people to attribute others' behaviors internally to dispositional factors and their own behavior to external or environmental factors. Research has provided substantial evidence for this effect and some extensions and qualifications. For example, Not only do we attribute others' behavior more dispositionally than our own, but we also consider their behavior to be more stable and predictable than our own. The valence of the behavior also matters. People make more dispositional attributions for socially desirable than socially undesirable behavior, irrespective of who the actor is, and actors are more dispositional in attributing positive behavior and more situational in attributing negative behavior than are observers. The actor observer effect can be inverted if someone knows their behavior is dispositionally caused. Finally, the actor observer effect can be erased or reversed if the actor is encouraged to take the role of observer regarding the behavior to be attributed and the observer the role of actor. Now, the actor becomes more dispositional and the observer becomes more situational. There are two main explanations for the actor observer effect. The first one is perceptual focus. For the observer, the actor and the actor's behavior are figural against the background of the situation. However, actors cannot see themselves behaving, so the background situation assumes the role of figure against the background of the self. Actor and the observer quite literally have different perspectives on the behavior and therefore explain it in different ways. Perceptual salience does indeed seem to play an important role in the causal explanation. Second factor, informational differences. Another reason why actors tend to make external attributions and observers internal ones is that actors have a wealth of information to draw on about how they have behaved in other circumstances. They may actually know that they behave differently in different contexts and thus quite accurately consider their behavior to be under situational control. Observers are not privy to this autobiographical information. They see the actor behaving in a certain way in one context or limited range of contexts and have no information about how the actor behaves in other contexts. It is therefore not an unreasonable assumption to make a dispositional attribution. Now, I like to summarize the actor observer effect. The tendency for individuals acting in situation to attribute the causes of their behavior to external or situational factors such as social pressure, but for observers to attribute the same behavior to internal or dispositional factors such as personality. For example, when a doctor tells someone that their cholesterol levels are elevated and the patient might blame the factors that are outside their control such as genetic or environmental influences. But what about when someone else finds out that their cholesterol levels are too high? In such situations, people attribute it to things such as poor diet and lack of exercise. In other words, when it is happening to us, it is outside our control, but when it is happening to someone else, it is their fault. Self-serving bias. Suppose that you write a paper and when you get it back, you find the following comment on the first page: an outstanding paper, one of the best I have seen in years, and you get an A grade. To what will you attribute this success? Probably you will explain it in terms of internal causes. You have high level of talent, the effort you invested in writing the paper, and so on. Now, in contrast, imagine that when you get the paper back, these comments are written on it: unsatisfactory paper, one of the worst I have seen in years, and you get a D grade. How will you interpret this outcome? The chances are good that you will be tempted to focus mainly on external situational factors. The difficulty of the task, your professor's unfairly harsh grading standards, the fact that you did not have enough time to do a good job, and so on. This tendency to attribute our own positive outcomes to internal causes but negative ones to external factors is known as the self-serving bias. It appears to be both in general in scope and powerful in its effects. Attribution is influenced by our desire for a favorable image of ourselves. We make attributions that satisfy self-serving biases. Overall, we take credit for our positive behaviors and successes as reflecting who we are and our intention and effort to do positive things, which is the self-enhancing bias. At the same time, we explain away our negative behaviors and failures as being due to coercion, normative constraints, and other external situational factors that do not reflect who we really are, which is the self-protecting bias. This is a robust effect that holds true across many cultures. Self-serving biases are clearly ego-serving. Why does this tilt in our attributions occur? Several possibilities have been suggested, but most of these fall into two categories: cognitive and motivational explanations. The cognitive model suggests that self-serving bias stems mainly from certain tendencies in the way we process social information. Specifically, it suggests that we attribute positive outcomes to internal causes, but negative ones to external causes, because we expect to succeed and have a tendency to attribute expected outcomes to internal causes more than to external causes. In contrast, the motivational explanation suggests that the self-serving bias stems from our need to protect and enhance our self-esteem or the related desire to look good to others. Overall, it is most likely both cognitive and motivational factors have a role, and they are difficult to disentangle from one another. Regardless of the origins of the self-serving bias, it can be the cause of much interpersonal friction. It often leads to people working with others on a joint task to perceive that they, not their partners, have made major contributions and to blame others in the group for negative outcomes. Self-enhancing biases are more common than self-protecting bias, partly because people with low self-esteem tend not to protect themselves by attributing their failures externally, rather they attribute them internally. Both these forms of bias can be muted by a desire not to be seen to be boasting over our successes and lying about our failures, but they are not totally extinguished. One self-serving bias which most of us have exploited from time to time is the self-handicapping. The self-handicapper, we are suggesting that, reaches out for impediments, exaggerates handicaps, embraces any factor reducing personal responsibility for mediocrity and enhancing personal responsibility for success. People self-handicap in this way when they anticipate failure, whether in their job performance, in sport, or even in therapeutic settings. When being sick allows one to drop out of life, what a person often will do is intentionally and publicly make external attributions for a poor showing even before it happens. Another instance of self-serving attribution surfaces when attribution of responsibility is influenced by an outcome bias. People tend to attribute greater responsibility to someone who is involved in an accident with large rather than small consequences. For example, we would attribute greater responsibility to the captain of a super tanker that spills millions of liters of oil than to a captain of a charming little fishing boat that spills only a few liters. Although the degree of responsibility may actually be the same, this effect quite probably reflects the tendency for people to cling to an illusion of control by believing in a just world. People like to believe that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. That is, people get what they deserve and that people have control over and responsibility for their outcomes. This attributional pattern seems a controllable and secure place in which we can determine our own destiny. Belief in a just world can result in a pattern of attribution where victims are often deemed responsible for their misfortune, poverty, oppression, tragedy and injustice. All happen because victims deserve it. Examples of the just world hypothesis in action are such views as the unemployed are responsible for being out of work and rape victims are responsible for the violence against them. Another example is that belief still held by people that 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust were responsible for their own fate and that they deserved it. Just world beliefs are also an important component of many religious ideologies. Interestingly, the results of several studies indicate that the strength of the self-serving bias varies across cultures. In particular, it is weaker in cultures such as those in Asia that place a greater emphasis on group outcomes and group harmony than it is in Western cultures where individual accomplishments are emphasized and it is considered appropriate for winners to gloat over their victories. I would now like to summarize the self-serving bias. It is nothing but the tendency to attribute successes to internal factors and failures to situational factors. This bias tends to increase as time passes after an event. Therefore, the further in the past an event occurs, the more likely people are to congratulate themselves for the success and to blame the situation for the failure. I would now like to summarize what we have learnt in today's class. We first learnt about what are attribution errors, and then we started to learn the different types of errors in attribution. We first learnt in detail what is the fundamental attribution error, and then we discussed about what is the actor observer bias, and in the end we discussed what is the self-serving bias.